Alright guys, I was on Facebook earlier and somebody asked how you can model a dice, and I thought, well, that's a 2-minute job. So I started making a video and it's turned into this absolute beast of a tutorial where we're going to cover modeling, rendering, compositing, animation modifiers, physics. So I got a little bit carried away, but it's definitely worth a watch, so let's dive in. And if you want to massively reduce your cycle's render times and save a ton of electricity, then check out Turbo Tools version 3, which you can get from 3d-illusions.co.uk. And you can also get this scene file from the members area. So we'll add a cube, Shift A, Mesh, Cube, into edit mode, face mode by pressing 3 on the keyboard. We'll select all the faces and we'll press I to insert. If you get this effect, nothing's happening, just press I again and it will change it to individual origins and then you can just inset it. Once we've done that, so Control R, left click and then right click, Control R, left click, right click, and then again Control R, left click, right click. We'll come out of edit mode and we'll add a subdivision modifier by pressing Control 1. Let's come out of full screen, Control space, go into the modifiers. We can see we've got the subdivision modifier in the side there. Control A to apply that, back into edit mode. And now if we go into vertex mode by pressing number 1 on the keyboard, we can start adding the dots. So the opposite sides of a dice always add up to 7 as far as I'm aware. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means on the opposite side we're going to want 1. So shift click this one. And then we'll go on this side. So we'll start with 2. That means to make it up to 7 we need to make 5 on this side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then finally 3, 1, 2, 3, and then the other side 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got all of the vertices selected for the dots. Press Control B, and then we'll press V to do it on the vertices. Scroll down on the scroll wheel until you've got no subdivisions, so they're just squares, and then we'll do I. And we'll inset slightly to give ourselves a support loop. And then press dot on the keyboard and make sure you've got individual origins selected. And then press the comma key and make sure you've got your orientation set to normal. What this means is, if I do GZ, you can see we get a line coming out of each one. And that will allow us to move along each individual face's own Z normal. But we're not going to move it, we're going to do an extrude. So press E. And then hold shift and just move it backwards with your mouse. And then if we come back out of edit mode, we've got this shape, which we can now apply more subdivisions to. So Control 2, right click, and then shade auto smooth. Maybe with Control 3 to make it a bit smoother. And then we can apply this. So we've got the final dice. What we can do now is start adding materials. So go into the shader tab and we'll say add a new material and we'll call this one dots, and then we'll add another new one and we'll call this one dice white. So go into cycles, make sure you've got cycles render engine enabled and turn on rendered view. So there we go. You can see here, I'm actually using a HDRI image, and this HDRI image is from HDRI Haven. It's one of the Christmas ones. I'll show you. If we go into the shader editor's world mode, this particular one is called Christmas Photo Studio 04, and I've downloaded it in 8K. It's completely free, and you can use it in your commercial work as well. I'll put a link in the description below. But basically, once if you've not got your world set up, all you've got to do is add these nodes. So Shift A, S, and just search for environment texture, and then once you've downloaded the HDRI, just load it in here with open, and then you connect it to a mapping node and a texture coordinate node set to generated. Once you've done that, you can then move the HDRI around using the Z rotation. Back to the object mode of the shader editor, we'll start with dice white. I'm going to make it a glossy material by reducing the roughness. And we need to assign it to the different parts of the mesh. So let's go in here, and at the moment we've still got these interior parts selected. So that's good. We can now expand that, Control plus if we want to, maybe to about here, and we'll make those black. So under the shader tab, we'll click on the dice dots, or the dots, and just click assign, and then we'll make these black. And then we'll invert the selection, Control I, and then we'll assign the dice white. And now we can start modifying the material a little bit. I think I've gone a bit too far there. So go back in, I'll click on dots, just deselect everything, click dots, and I'll choose select. I'll go Control minus, Control I, and then I'll just select white material and assign those. So look at that. That's better. Alright, so we'll probably make those a little bit, the black material a little bit darker. Not too dark, because nothing really is completely black in real life. And we'll turn the roughness down a little bit, probably to about there. So there we are, we've got the dice created. What we can do now is start adding the physics simulation. So Shift A, we'll drop down a plane, we'll scale it up a bit, and we'll bring it down a little bit as well. Doesn't really matter if it's touching perfectly because we're going to simulate this anyway. Let's come out of cycles mode for now. We'll move this up in the air and rotate it a little bit. And we're going to take this one into edit mode, number 3 for face mode, and extrude it down a bit so we've got some thickness. Control A, apply the scale. And the first thing we want to do is just give this dice a correct weight. So the correct weight for a dice is 0.0041 kilogram. Is the correct weight for a dice. If we press play, it's going to fall straight through the floor, and that's because we need to put physics on this as well. So go into the physics tab, under rigid body, but this time, instead of active, because we don't want it to fall down like that, we're going to change it to passive, and that means it's going to stay in place. So press play, now the dice is going to move around on it. But you can see, because it's so big, this dice, if we go into the end panel, is actually 2 meters by 2 meters. And although it's falling at exactly the same speed as a smaller item, we perceive speed based to be relative on the size of the object. So for example, an ant that travels 2 meters in 3 seconds is going to be really fast compared to, say, a bus that travels 3 meters in 2 seconds. So let's put this down to, dice is 1.6 centimeters, so 0.016. So we've got this really small dice now, apply the scale. If we play this back, you can see it falls much faster. Well, it appears to fall much faster. Let's move it down closer to the ground, till we're much closer, to about here. There we go. Let's come into the point of impact, about here. Let's go into cycles mode, let's just see where the shadow is. Well, actually, that's surprisingly worked out incredibly well. I thought that was going to be quite problematic. Let's play that back. So there we go. We've got the animation sorted out. Now we can play around with the settings because obviously we might want a little bit of bounce on this. So I'm going to turn up the bounciness. But we need to do it both on the plane and the dice. Let's turn them up on both. If we play this back, we get a much more bouncy result. Let's just come out of rendered mode. There we go, so that's a really good result. So let's make this tabletop a little bit smaller so we can see more of the background. About there, and we'll apply the scale, rewind it, and let's get this underneath, and play that back, and that'll do quite nicely. If you run into any problems regarding collisions, then what I found was if you reduce the sensitivity, so the collision margin, turn that on and turn the margin down to 0, and then do the same for the plane as well, under sensitivity, then that resolved most of the problems that I had regarding the cube going through the ground, or the cube floating above the ground. that resolved those issues. But that's looking good. So we'll turn on the cycles viewport now. So I'll just move the table so the dice lands on the corner, and then the camera can be hovered over the center of the table where the dice comes towards it. And then we can rotate the HDRI until we get a good angle. I thought it looked quite good around about here. And obviously we want to get the camera in there, so Shift A, and we'll add a camera. And Control 0, that will set the camera as the active scene camera. Press 0 again, that will come back out of camera mode into viewport mode. And then Control Alt 0 to align the camera to the view. We'll go into camera settings, and we're going to change the focal length until we get more of this scene in the background. So probably about there. Maybe, in fact, let's zoom in. Let's go into view, camera to view, so you can move the camera. I'd like to get a little bit bigger on that dice, but the problem is, as I zoom in, I'm covering up more of the room with the table. So what I'm going to do is change the start height and rotation of the dice so that it's not falling from as a larger of a height, and then it won't bounce as far. So I'll be able to move closer to the landing place. There we are, that's better. So we can move the camera closer, and that will allow us to get more of that background in. Rewind it, maybe rotate it a bit. Doesn't matter that I can't see it. And we can probably give it a little bit less friction. We'll go into physics, and then we'll just turn the friction down a bit so it slides a little bit more. And maybe a tad more bounce. Next thing I want to do is turn on a bit of motion blur before I forget. So into here, render settings, go down to motion blur, and I've got it turned on. So I've kept it at the default of 0.5 center on frame, which gave me a nice result as we saw at the beginning. And we need to add to the camera a bit of depth of field. So let's go into camera settings, depth of field, turn that on. Hover your mouse over distance and press E, and then click on where the dice is at the end. That's given us this really nice broker effect. And we can control that. It's more easy to control, in fact, if we go into viewport preview mode, I think it's called. And then we can start changing the f-stop until we get the amount of focus we want on the background element. I don't want them to be completely out of focus. I mean, it does look nice like that, but it's a bit too much. I'm going to put it down so it's just slightly out of focus on the background. And we're going to change the ratio so that the broker is sort of not round, it's elongated. Let me just show you what that does. We've got it higher. If we change the ratio to something like 1.9, you can see they become long instead of round, which is more typical of what you get in photography. About 1.9 is a good value. I'll leave the rest as they are, and then I'll change this f-stop again to bring this back into focus a little. We'll go back to cycles. That's pretty good, maybe a little bit too much. Let's bring it up to about 32. Next thing, we're going to add a material to the surface. So back into the object mode, new material. And I've actually used a material from a website called Ambient CG. So it's this one here, ambientcg.com. Marble texture, completely free, and it's CCO, so you can even use it in commercial work as well. I went with the 8K one, and this will download all of the different textures. Once you've done that, with your mouse over the shader editor, press Ctrl-Shift-T. This requires you to have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, so make sure you enable that in the add-on preferences. And then we'll select all of the tileable image textures. We don't need this one though, the DX. And then principal texture setup, and it will automatically wire all that up for us. You can see we've got this nice texture on the desk. Now, it's a little bit too big at the moment, so I'm going to Shift A, S, a value node, drop this in here. You can now increase or decrease the size of that marble texture by increasing the value here. Now, obviously, 76 is way too big. Probably something like 5 is a nice result. 1 is the default, which I think was a little bit too low resolution. So let's put it to 5. Probably 3 looks pretty good. So that's all set up. We've got the motion blur set up. The only thing left to do now is render it. And go to the render settings, Now, if you're using turbo tools, you can use the settings I've got here. Just make sure that you turn on enhanced textures so that, unlike the standard denoisers that come with Blender, we don't lose all that fine detail on the marble texture. Let's just quickly add a little bit, just a tiny bit of subsurface scattering to the dice material on here. Slot 2, we want dice white, giving it a bit more realism, maybe 0.005. Just very subtle. Let's minimize that. If you don't have turbo render, then you'll do it in the sample area, and you'll just have to do trial and error until you find a result that works well. With that done, we go to the compositor, and because I'm using turbo, I'll just set a cache location so I can do extra things afterwards if I want to. And render, and then turbo tools render animation, or just Control F12 again if you don't have turbo tools. Oh, and actually one thing I forgot we need to do, and that's give the camera a little bit of motion as well. So we'll select the camera, we'll go into the graph editor, and we need to add at least one keyframe to be able to animate this with modifiers. So click on the camera, over the viewport, press I, and just add a keyframe on frame 1 for location and rotation. And now we've got these available in the left hand side. Now I only want to animate the rotation, not the location, so I'll just hide these. And in actual fact, while we're on the subject, it's very important that you don't move the camera when you're working with a HDRI, because if you move the camera, the HDRI and the 3D objects will start sliding around on top of each other in a completely unrealistic way. So instead of moving the camera forwards and backwards, what you'd do instead is animate the focal length of the camera to zoom in and out that way. Now we'll click on the X rotation, go into modifiers on the right side in the N panel. If you don't have that, just press N, and then we'll add some noise. Let's play this back. You can see that's way too jittery, so we'll just turn down the strength to something like 0.01 or 0.02. Now it's way too fast. So what we need to do, let me just turn off screencast keys, is change the scale so it's much slower. Maybe something like that, but again it's way too much, so we'll change the strength down to 0.1, maybe 0.01. Just very slight, just to give it a bit more realism, as if somebody's holding the camera. Maybe 0.02. Yeah, 0.02 looks good. Now we can copy this by clicking on the copy modifier button here, go to the Y, and we'll paste it in, and now we're going to get a little bit of tilt left and right. I don't want so much tilt though, so I'm going to turn that down a little bit to 0.01, and then we'll offset it slightly so that the tilt is not happening at exactly the same time as the up and down action, just to make it a bit more realistic. Go to the next one for the Z, and this is going to be doing the left and right, so paste it again, and now we've got automated movement of the camera on all of the rotation axes, just to give it that little bit more realism, and we'll offset that again just to make it completely different from the other tracks. Maybe turn the scale down so it moves left and right a little bit faster. Probably about there. I think we'll just take the camera back a little bit. We'll bring it back a bit, make sure you're on frame 1, just about here probably. And I'll press I. And this time I only want to add keyframes for the location so that I don't mess up the rotation. Now if we play this back, that gives us a bit more space underneath to get the reflection in when we render it. Alright. So back to the compositor, and we'll start rendering again. Alright, so that's finished rendering. Don't worry about this, by the way. This is because I'm using turbo tools, which incidentally, I'll show you something in a second. But for now, here's the result. And I think that's looking really nice in actual fact. Now it's been rendered, all the reflections are pretty good. And it's really nice how the camera's moving around. Now, there are additional things we can do to make this much better. And although I'm going to do this with turbo tools, if you don't have turbo tools, where I've got the cache for scene node at the beginning here, just bring back in your rendered image sequence, and you can replace the cache for scene node that I'm using with your image sequence and do exactly the same thing, except at the end when I click publish, you'll just need to render it out again with the 3D scene disabled. So I've just renamed the file output to dice enhanced so that I don't overwrite the original, and we'll turn the backdrop on at the top and then press Ctrl Shift click on the cache for scene node, or in your case the image sequence you've rendered, and that will add this viewer node, and then we can see in the backdrop the changes that we're going to make. We're going to use something called the scopes, and the scopes will allow us to get the best possible image without having to rely on the monitor, because the monitor might not be the best source, particularly if you're not using a really top of the range sort of couple of £1,000 monitor. And the aim is we want to get the waveform to fit within this 0 to 100 range, but not go above it or below it, otherwise we're going to get clipping. So get it as bright as possible without any clipping, just to make the image look as nice as we can. Alright, so Shift A, S, and put down an RGB node first, drop this in here, and we're just going to increase this until the scope on the right hand side there, all the bits in it are going up to the top. So we can see there, let's increase that a little bit. We're up to the top now, so these highlights, this area here, basically it covers the image from left to right. So this is the left of the image, this is the right of the image, this is the left to right, left to right. So this bit in the middle, obviously, is probably going to be these bright things in the window, or this bit on the table there. So we don't want to go any higher than that. But already, it's brightened it quite a bit. Just press M. You can see it's really made that image pop a little bit more. Now, at the moment as well, if we look here, the dark areas, there's nothing touching the black. So anything that's supposed to be black is currently a little bit grey. So I'm going to bring those down a little bit. Shift A, S, RGB curve again. And this time I'm going to move the bottom left one to the right. And you'll see that's way too much. But because it's so finicky trying to move this little dot around to get this correct, it's easier to move it too much and then turn it down with a factor. And the aim is to turn it down until the bottom part of the waveform is touching the 0 on the graph. Let's bring it up until we're down to the bottom and about there. So that gives it a bit more contrast, and let's just mute these to do a before and after. So this is after and then before. So it's looking a bit dingy before we made these changes, and then afterwards it's looking much brighter. And if we want to make changes now to make it even brighter without introducing any clipping, what we can do, let's have another one and bring that up. And by the way, always make sure when you're compositing that color management is set to standard, not filmic, and that look is none, exposure 0 and gamma 1. This is under the render panel at the bottom under color management. If you change it to filmic, then every time you make a change, filmic is going to make another change that it thinks will make the image look good. But you want to be in control of your own image basically, because look at that, it's made it all dark again. So let's put it back to standard, and then we've got that extra oomph back in the picture. Now we can increase the mid-range, or the gamma as it's correctly called, to add even more brightness while still maintaining no clipping. Maybe we've gone over just a tiny bit, in which case we can just bring that down just a touch. And then lastly, one more curve, RGB curve, and this time we can add some contrast by bringing this one down, or just a very slight amount, and this one up just a very slight amount, and that's added a bit more pop to the image. So before, after. Just adds a little bit of contrast to make all the details stand out a bit more, by making the bright areas brighter and the dark areas darker, just to add a bit more separation between the two, to give a bit more contrast. And then lastly, the magic touch that always makes all renders look incredible, the lens distortion node. So drop this in, and we're going to add just a tiny bit of dispersion. We don't want to go crazy with this, otherwise it will look stupid. But for example, if I put 0.5, then that looks ridiculous. And it also takes a very long time to calculate. So we're going to put 0.05, let's try that. Probably still a bit too much, 0.01. I think 0.02, it's very subtle. It definitely fools your brain a little bit more into thinking it's realistic. And we could also add a little bit of distortion. So 0.1 will distort it towards the camera. It will bring the middle towards the camera. Negative 0.1 will take it in the opposite direction. 0.01, let's try that. Let's just have a look without. And then I'm going to change the output name of this. So let's change it to, so dice enhance, I've already done it. Bring up the end panel, and now I'm going to click on publish again. Let's just save it first in case you get any problems. Publish animation, and you can see it goes through really quick, and it's building that new video with the new settings that we've got. At this stage, if you don't have turbo render, you'll just need to mute the render layers node and then render again. And then if we compare the animation before and after, this is before the enhancements we've just made, and this one is after. So quite an improvement. Now, one thing that's really bothering me now that I'm watching this back is that the dice is just not taking up enough of the screen. It's too small. So what I'd like to do is improve on that and also add another effect that will add a lot to the realism as well. So let's do that quickly now. Let's play it back. So I think when we get to about here, let's modify the zoom. So we go to the focal length, make sure we're on frame 1, and we'll set the focal length keyframe by hovering over it and pressing I. And then we'll play the timeline forward until we get to a point where the dice is coming to a standstill, and that's the point where we want to be zoomed in. So let's bring the focal length up to about 50, and then shift tilde on the keyboard. Tilde is the one just below escape. Bring that down so it's more central. About there. And then I'm going to record the rotation. Let's see how this looks. So I forgot to record the focal length. Let's do that again. I'm using the up arrow to move to the next keyframe here, or the down arrow moves to the previous one. So back into 50, I think it was 50. There we are, maybe even more. Let's go about here. We'll press I. Alright, so let's do this. Got a bit of a twitch on the end there. Not sure what's caused that. I must have got 2 keyframes. Let's have a look. Oh, where is it? Home? Ah, there we are, at the bottom. What's that? The Z rotation. Not sure how that happened. X, delete keyframe. Oh, that's better. Let's try that. There we go. Now what I wanted to do is struggle with the focus when it gets to about here. We're going to change the distance of this. So let's record this at here, and then we'll go a few frames forward to about here, and then we're going to bring this down a little bit so it goes out of focus. Press I, and then we'll go forward again, a few frames, and then we'll bring it back into focus by pressing E to bring up the eyedropper, and then we'll click on the dice again, and then we'll press I. Let's play this back. Perfect. So that's a more realistic result, I think. So I'll quickly render that out using the same method as before, and this is the result. So I think you'll agree that is way more interesting to look at, and I think it's also a much more realistic, not in a small part, thanks to that effect of the camera trying to focus unsuccessfully on the dice as it zooms in. So that's the end of the tutorial. If you do like these tutorials and you'd like to see more, then you can always support the channel by visiting 3d-illusions.co.uk. There's a members area there, which is incredibly cheap. It also includes lots of downloadable content, scene files, geometry node setups, and even paid content is included as well that other people that aren't members would have to pay for. So thanks for watching, and I hope it's been useful and interesting, and I'll catch you in the next one.